somebody took a big studio's money, or a production company, really. I'm not sure what the financing package was for the Black Phone 2. And it's not a lot. But this film is way more experimental than I bet they expected when those big companies signed on for the sequel. I kind of liked it, to be honest with you. It was scary, pretty scary. It wasn't too scary to watch, although I'm easily scared. So some of you might be like, oh, is this movie for wimps? I thought it was very interesting, as we're about to discuss, and also surprisingly sad. This is a very, very sad movie. Very sad. And oh boy, am I curious to see the reaction of general audiences. Cause, as I said, Scott Derrickson, he's got a lot of tricks up his sleeve with this movie. First off, in addition to the more experimental nature of the film, Mason Thames is not the star this time around, but instead is swapped out for his sister, once again played by Madeleine McGraw. Now, McGraw does a very nice job as the new lead of this film, and Thames is certainly a strong supporting character. He's in it a lot. But I do think that audiences are getting tired and frustrated by these surprise swaps, as to who's the real lead of the movie. And I would caution Hollywood against surprising people once they get to the theater. I think they should have a pretty good idea what they're buying a ticket for. And most of you don't know what you're buying a ticket for Black Phone 2. I'm going to fill you in on it a little bit. But I think that there will be some people who are like, what the heck is this? Now, I got major The Conjuring vibes from this sequel, but instead of a husband and wife, you have a brother and sister battling demons and solving supernatural mysteries. McGraw, like Vera Farmiga, is the strong psychic ability of the team. But while Patrick Wilson, I would say, is the love, faith, and, strategic half of the couple, like he does all the research and he knows all the things that they should do, right? I would say Thames here is the muscle. And that was a cool idea to bring that to this kind of movie, because here you can physically hurt demons, although they can physically hurt you too. It was cool to see wounds inflicted in the dreamscape materialize in the real world. I liked that. But there's more! While the original Black Phone had psychic elements, the core of the film was a young boy going up against his kidnapper and potential assaulter in the real world. And the core of the film, again, was a race to stop something terrible from happening in the real world. However, now that Derrickson has a second film, he clearly has his eyes set on, I guess he was like, well, how can I continue this story unless this is the unluckiest family in the world? And he kind of still made it that the case. But he's trying to create now an ongoing franchise, which, to be honest with you, compared to the first film, feels like a very different movie. Yes, the supernatural is front and center here. This is a supernatural movie, whereas I wouldn't classify the first film that way. Maybe you would. But most of the action, and also because it's a spiritual film, there are very strong religious elements. And most of the action takes place at a Christian youth camp, isolated and virtually empty due to an unnatural storm. Ooh, I kind of like the storm. They did a nice job with that. They had a nice thing about like hell isn't, the burns of hell are for freezer burn. And you're like, man, that's pretty good. But there are no detectives this time and no real world villain, only a spiritual one, the Grabber, who's pretty ticked off that Finn killed him. Also, there are ghosts of 3 young boys at this camp to mirror the dead boys who helped Finn in the first movie. They're like, let's continue with that theme. And that does, I think, luckily they have the phone. And the phone being away going forward for the spiritual world to contact particular, Finn doesn't have dreams. So the spiritual world likes to cut him on the phone. That was funny. But that's like that, and the Grabber is how they kind of still tie it to the first film. So it seems kind of like the first movie. But again, while most of the action in the first film took place in the real world, here almost all of the action takes place in the spiritual world. It's the same place, only, you're on a different plane. The Astral Plane, if you will, comic book fans. But even in the Astral Plane in comics, you go to a different place. This movie can't afford that. So you're in the same, we'll talk about what, I actually kind of like the technique that they used, but you're actually just like on a different level in the same space. So the grabber can occasionally reach out into the real world, but most of the movie is Gwen through her dreams going into the spiritual world and taking him head on. Not just the X-Men, but I see a lot of Stephen King here as well, with Gwen spending a lot of the movie learning about the spiritual plane, how to navigate it, and maybe even how to control it. Oh, as a comic book fan, I liked that part quite a bit. In fact, I think this movie would, if I was given notes on this movie, I'd be like, make her more powerful. I was like, how does she not go like full Jean Grey or Professor Xavier in the third act? But maybe they're hoping to do that with the Black Phone 3, or Carrie, or Firestarter, or The Shining, or whatever. But they only kind of hint at that. But when they did, it was like so cool. You were like, give me more of that. And they're like, we don't have the money. All right. Now, as many of you know, Latino and Hispanic audiences love horror movies. However, when the genre tries to appeal to them directly, through Hollywood at least, so far, it has not worked out. But the Black Phone 2 is going to try anyway. Part of me wonders if maybe they should have played this element of the film up more in the ad campaign. Because again, Latino and Hispanic audiences love this genre. So wouldn't it be nice to know, well, again, every time Hollywood has been like, representation for you in the horror genre, Latino and Hispanic audiences have said, no, thank you. So again, I'll be curious to see how this works out, because it's kind of like somewhere in the middle. Like they did it, but they didn't talk about it. All right, so not only is Gwen kind of dating Ernesto, their flirtation is very sweet. I thought that was a nice element in the movie as their relationship progresses. But Ernesto is the younger brother of Robin from the first movie, actually played by the same actor. And I think they should have made more of a big deal about that, because when, especially Finn looks at Ernesto, how is that not traumatizing for him to see his former friend who was killed by the grabber? And then helped Finn to then escape. I think that should have been played up a little bit more, especially because, Finn's dealing with a lot of stuff, as we're going to discuss. But anyway, also when it comes to the Hispanic and Latino representation, when they get to this Christian youth camp, they discover that it's currently owned by Demian Bichir. That was a great surprise. And his niece works there as well, played by Ariana Rivas. And also early on in the film, I'll talk about Demian Bichir more in a moment. But earlier on in the film, Ernesto also gives Gwen as a gift this beautiful set of, I think they're Loteria cards, Loteria, Mexican tarot cards. They were absolutely beautiful, so well illustrated. They were really, really nice. And she was so happy to get them. But I'm not quite sure what they're called, because they never dealt with them. They never dealt with them again. That deck of cards never came back, which I thought was ridiculous. I was like, how do you introduce Mexican tarot cards into the story and give them to someone who has spiritual abilities, and then we don't use them? Maybe she'll pull them out in Black Phone 3. All right, as I said, they're really trying to set up a new franchise. Oh, there's also a white couple who works at the camp, but they're not very nice. Although I will say that Maeve Beatty is pretty funny as Barb, who just basically goes full Karen during the movie. Rivas isn't given much to do, but Bichir is absolutely fantastic. When Ethan Hawke in the first film elevated it with his talent, experience, and star power. Bichir, I think, does that in the sequel quite well. He really is a wonderful actor, and he keeps the movie from becoming like a teen horror movie, pulling it into the all ages, I think, more into that realm. He just really did a nice job. Ethan Hawke has returned for this film, but I have a sneaking suspicion only his voice has truly come back. And they used a body double for all of the actual on-camera performance. But, that works in The Mandalorian, fantastic. So, it worked here, to be honest with you. Although, I could tell. I was like, I think if Ethan Hawke was actually here, we'd see Ethan Hawke. It was cool. The mask is very effective. And, the mask in the first film would come apart. And here it kind of does too. But in a really gruesome, interesting way. But again, I was like, is Ethan Hawke under there? And by the end of the movie, my verdict was, he is not. All right, so the Grabber, though, overall remains a terrifying villain. I guess the mask is a little bit like Scream, too. This movie borrows from a lot of other movies. And on that note, the Grabber enjoys his victims' fear as much as he does their pain. And in that regard, he reminds me a lot of Pennywise, because I'm getting ready for Welcome to Derry, watching the screeners, rewatching the It movies, and I'm like, I see a lot of Pennywise vibes here. And of course, Welcome to Derry comes out starts in just like a week or two. So yes, I do feel The Black Phone 2 is extremely derivative of a lot of other horror movies, but there's one thing that it can call its own, and that's its exploration, quite meaningfully, of emotional trauma. As you might recall, the father in the first movie was an alcoholic to try and deal with the pain of his wife's suicide. And, by the end of the film, he got sober, and he's still dealing with that in the sequel. And Jeremy Davies does a great job. He always pops when he's on screen, although I have to say, he doesn't seem at all like these kids' dad. So there always feels like there's a little bit of a disconnect, but he does a nice job. And anyway, there's a correlation because Finn has developed a marijuana habit as a way to deal with what happened to him in the first movie. The first movie only hinted at it, but there's definitely a perverse element to the Grabber, which is again hinted at here. And to even explore that a little in this type of a studio horror film, and what that's like for a survivor to go through that situation, a young man, I think it's very important and very moving. And then I think that Mason Thames and director and co-writer Scott Derrickson do a really nice job portraying that honestly, but without making it salacious. I thought that it was, as I said, unique for this kind of film, and very well done. Also with the retro vibes though, it did make me think of Shaggy in a different light. I was like, maybe he was baked all the time in those Scooby-Doo cartoons as a way to cope with all the mysteries they made him keep going on. I mean, we always knew that Shaggy didn't want to do it, right? And he was easily freaked out. So that was his coping mechanism. So, I thought that was a very interesting look at, substance abuse, the meaning behind it. They had some interesting conversations in the film. Likewise, Gwen is terrified that her visions, which are getting more and more intense, will drive her insane like they did her mother. And the movie actually explores Finn and Gwen's mother quite a bit. And that's all I'll say. I liked that element of the movie a lot. So yeah, I called this an experimental movie. Let me tell you why. Made for just a little over $20 million, that doesn't give Scott Derrickson a big budget to play with, especially since he's decided to make a spiritual plane movie, right? I'm like, why don't you just keep him in the real world if that's all the money you have? And also, by the way, he's clearly spent a lot of his money on ice and snow effects, quite effectively, I might add. There was one scene where the Grabber had like ice skates made out of ice, and I was like, well, I kind of like that a lot. With his like rotted skin stuck in the ice, with as the ice skates melded to his foot. It was just a really quick shot, but for some reason it really stuck with me. So how's Scott Derrickson going to depict the spiritual plane? Home movie footage style. So whenever Gwen is having one of her dreams, you get like this high-grain 1970s cinematic feel. And so whenever she wakes up, the picture kind of comes more into focus. It was a cool effect, but I must say, very low energy. So I think when the movie starts, you're like, this is what we're doing for the spiritual plane. But once you make your peace with it, and you could be like, oh, okay, from an artistic perspective, this is an interesting idea, then it gets a little bit better. But the pacing of the movie is not good. The first act, it's kind of slow, like 20 to 30 minutes. The two women next to me spent a decent amount of that time talking to each other. Well, like they're not full on talking all the time, but more talking than there should be in a movie theater. And then in fact, one of them even got on their phone a couple of times. I mean, very unusual behavior for a press screening, but what can you do? Well, what you can do is the guy behind them in the row behind us, he at one point leaned forward and said, please get off your phone. But to be fair to these two women, even I was a little bored. I mean, I was like, it's kind of frustrating that they're on their phone, but I can't totally blame them because the urge for me to go on my own phone was very strong. However, I will say that the beginning of the second act, when Finn finally picks up and really talks on the phone, I won't say what he's been doing beforehand because that was interesting. But when he's finally like, what is it? And you find out the real mystery, like things start to get, the pacing picks up, things are more energetic and they start to have more action. They bring in the music more. It becomes more of, I think, the movie people expected to go and see. You just got to get so if you're sitting through those first 20, 30 minutes being like, we should have made a mistake. Should we leave? No, at least wait until, again, he really truly picks up that phone. There's also, by the way, a very good scene, a dream sequence in the camp kitchen that they clearly spent money on as well. That was pretty good. If you don't like it by the time you get to by the end of the camp kitchen scene, then you're not going to like the rest of the movie. But if you're like, man, this movie's literally starting to cook, well, then you should stick around. So, with the strong snow and ice theme, I did like the strong snow and ice theme. That was nice. They had a cool, when they were arriving at the camp, there's this great shot out the window. I won't say what they see. That was really well done. But it was like the snow was coming down. You could barely see it. It was interesting. Then on top of that, the grainy footage approach for the spiritual plane, right? And an 80s synth soundtrack, which I believe is done by Scott Derrickson's brother. I mean, they have the same last name, Scott and Atticus. I'd say it adds up to a pretty interesting movie, but I don't know how commercial it is. I'm surprised. Honestly, it plays like someone's first movie, when in fact, it's actually Scott Derrickson's 9th film as a director. Can't he grow, Grace? Can't he try something different? Sure he can. And I think it's cool. He's kind of reinventing himself here. And to his credit, I would say this definitely feels like a theatrical movie instead of a streaming movie. So it's got that going for it, but then it might be a really great thing to watch at home on digital. I think that if Derrickson had kept Thames as the lead, or at least made him a true co-lead, and it had more real-world elements, like stopping something happening in the real world instead of going full spiritual ghost stuff, right? And had detectives come back into the story, that I think it would feel like it was building on the first film rather than making a strong pivot, right? I really do feel that if you liked the first Black Phone movie, I'm not sure how you're going to feel about this new movie, right? I mean, we'll see. We'll see. It is, I said it's good. I just don't think it's very commercial. But I don't know. As I said, the Conjuring vibes were strong. And that supposedly, well, I don't think it's going to wrap up because it just had its most successful movie yet. But even if it takes a little bit of a break, I think that Derrickson potentially really has something here with a brother-sister duo instead. And having one of them be the muscle, which I thought was really good. And they could maybe make more Black Phone movies. I'd like them to make another Black Phone movie, but I'd tell Derrickson to dial down or at least balance out the spiritual elements a little bit more. I guess I'd give him more money. If I think you gave Scott Derrickson whatever they're spending on the Conjuring movies, I'd be like, give him that. Give him a fighting chance. I'll look it up and put the number up here. I hope it's not the same. Then I'll be like, damn. They're doing more with that kind of money than you are, buddy. All right, so what do you think? What do you think? Share your thoughts down below. Subscribe today. And of course, as always, you can check out some more videos right now.